Hello, I'm environmental students. Today we're going to be talking about waste, trash, and is there even a way we can avoid making it in the first place? So when we talk about trash, we're going to call it solid domestic waste in our IB class. This is any sort of item that no longer has any value to the producer. And in the U.S., we call this municipal waste. So if we were looking on the EPA website or our Fairfax County website, that's what we would see. And it's going to totally depend on the lifestyle of the person and the area and how much they're going to produce. So for instance, an MEDC is totally going to have a lot more waste than an LEDC. Not only that, where they live is going to determine how much waste they could possibly produce because there might not be enough space, or it might be related to the types of waste they're going to be producing. There's got to be a lot more agricultural waste in a rural community than a city. And we can even compare two MEDCs, and they're going to have totally different waste production on average per person, and that is because of cultural values and all sorts of other environmental value systems. And so what we can see is for the U.S., our components of our waste are the following, and those different types of waste do change over time depending on how we are developing with our technology. But in general, waste is going to depend on the person, depend on the place. And in IB, we're going to focus on these top yellow types of waste. Organic waste is things like even eggshells, banana peels, etc. Packaging materials, we could think of that as cardboard, all right? And then textiles is like clothes. Hazardous materials is like paint. In Fairfax County, there are hazardous waste pickup sites so that they encourage people to not just dump their hazards in their backyard, in a stream, because that would be very bad. Things like batteries, you can usually find a place like Circuit City or Best Buy. There's usually a place to recycle batteries there. And dust is things that during the production of a house or making planks of wood, we might make some fine dust particles, and that's what we mean by dust. So in general, those top ones are really important for us. However, it is good to know the other ones because they do come up from time to time. Now, our major focus, though, is in thinking about the pros and cons of how we should deal with those wastes, types of materials, and some of it will depend on where we are, and some of it will depend on what type of waste. But in general, we're going to always have the same pollution management strategies. Reduction, all right, of the human activity or the waste in general, which is the reduce one. And we're going to have regulate and we're going to have restore. So first we're going to focus on reduce. And for reduce, we can see that we're going to talk about the four following things, and they're in order from most to least sustainable. So usually we hear about recycling a ton, but really reduce our waste is the most efficient thing. We'll talk about why. Reuse is the next best thing. Recycle is the next best thing after that, kind of at the same part as compost. Both of those are kind of similar, and you can only do depends on the type of material, which of these two you would pick. So the following four slides are going to go through each of those in general, and then we'll talk about regulate, and then we'll talk about restore. So let's jump into reduce. So reduce means let's just make less waste in general, all right? Let's just not even make those photocopies, let alone have to recycle them. All right, so the pros, let's just not have the waste in the first place. It's the cheapest strategy because I'm not even having to buy the thing in the first place. If we at school don't make as many photocopies, the school doesn't have to buy that much paper. And this is actually a big push at our school. However, this is really tough. The teachers don't really have the capacity to do that switch until every student has a laptop. We have to value not using paper. Everyone has to be on board, etc. Some examples we talked about, paperless teaching, for instance, at school. We could also think about our lives or for school, not having waste for our lunch. So let's get a reusable bottle so that we don't have to put our soup in like a temporary container every single time. Or instead of having a sandwich bag, put our sandwich in a bag that it always can go in and I can just wash it in between. So that's what a no-waste lunch is, or even a reusable tote so I don't have to use a brown bag every single time. Only pack as much food as you're going to eat. So that way we don't have to trash it or compost it. This is really hard because a lot of times people don't know how hungry they are. They might get full too fast. Their eyes are bigger than their stomach. So that's a really tough one. only carry reusables. So if I don't have a plastic water bottle, I'm not going to use it. Buy myself a really nice reusable water bottle. And that leads us straight into reusable. So this in general is not going to use that much energy because I'm just not even making more products. I don't have to transport more products. Now, and just use less paper in general. We talked about that one too. So reuse is kind of one of the related to reduce, because usually the only way I can reduce is if I'm reusing stuff. The big one we're going to be talking a lot in class is our reusable water bottles. How can we make our school, make our own lives use a reusable bottle? Because every time we even recycle a plastic bottle, what happens to it? So the pros are I can reuse something. Sometimes people use the word upcycle. It's going to use less energy than recycling. Recycling is actually very energy intensive. It's really simple to implement on a household or individual level because I just have to make the commitment to do this. Although sometimes it takes an initial financial payout to first get that nice bottle. But I'm going to save money in the long run. All right. We'll talk about a clothing swap if we'd like in class. That means like let's trade clothes instead of buying brand new clothes. All of these things are called reuse. All right. And so this is way better than recycling. And you guys are going to be brainstorming ways that we could reuse materials too in class. Recycling. So this is the one we always think about, and this is like the end-all be-all answer, but it's not. It's actually not the best. The pros, it is cheaper usually if materials are sorted. Certain areas of the world require materials to be sorted. In Fairfax, we have a single stream, which means we put all of our recyclable materials in the same bin. Materials are collected, separated, and processed if it's a single stream. The cons are it depends on the type of material we're recycling. Sometimes, really, because it took so much energy to make something that's plastic, and we don't even get that much out of a plastic being recycled, that it really is not that worthwhile. It is very wasteful. It takes fossil fuels to even do the recycling itself because it's so energy intensive to heat it back up and to do that, and it has really bad chemical byproducts. So if we were to rank things on how well we can recycle them, the best energy efficient recyclables, I bet you could guess, the best ones are glass, metal, paper, plastic. All right. We actually can't always recycle paper. We can only do it so many times. For instance, you might hear Miss Clausen say, hey, you can't recycle that paper towel because you can't. It's already been recycled too many times. You can't recycle tissues. It's usually something that was already kind of recycled. It's not high quality. And we'll talk more about plastic in class. Glass and metal aren't equal. We can also compare those in class, and hopefully we'll have a guest speaker and we can ask them questions about this as well. Composting. Composting only works for organics. So it will work for your vegetables, your fruits. Sometimes we can put things like eggshells and coffee grounds in it. But the really cool thing is we're recycling nutrients back into the soil. If we throw them into a landfill, they're not available to the environment system. We can use them in our parks. We can use them in growing food. We can use them in our own home gardens. But the cool thing is it's pretty easy to do this on a small scale, home or school. However, our school doesn't have one right now. The whole county of Arlington does this. You can put the out like you put your trash. But the hard part is it's a lifestyle change to remember to do this composting stuff. You do have to turn the composter once in a while. A lot of people don't want it in their own backyards or near them. They're worried it smells. They're worried it's kind of hazardous. But a lot of that has to do with not educating and knowing how it works. But really, we will really like this because it lowers food waste in general if we do have to throw away food waste. And it brings that stuff back into our environmental system, those really great nitrogen compounds, those really great carbon compounds that are really nutrient rich right back to the soil. So now let's move past reduce. Let's go on to regulate. So we could regulate the release of trash, and we could do this by just creating legislation to encourage recycling to be reused. We might in class talk about some examples, but one is in South Korea. They require you to sort the waste, and so they have these sorting machines nearby, and people will put them into the right type of stream. The really cool thing is the whole community becomes involved and becomes educated usually if there's a cultural shift and legislation going out to make this a whole initiative on a larger scale. And usually that means more people will do it. The cons is it's really hard to pass legislation. Enforcement of that legislation might be difficult depending on where we are. And sometimes when people get mad or they don't feel like they can pay for it or do these things, they might illegally dump in a place like a local stream. And that's pretty terrible. We could also impose taxes. So not just have encouragement like legislation, but we could also have you lose money if you are doing something. So for instance, in DC, they have a tax. You pay 5 cents for every plastic bag you need. And that actually helped them pay for a lot of their great garden programs in the area. There are also programs that are called pay-as-you-throw programs, such as in California, like Pasadena County. And they make you measure the weight of your waste. So a neighbor who is producing more waste, they actually have to pay more. And this kind of makes sense because it's going to take up more space in a landfill. And everyone is needing to use that landfill. So we can relate this to Tragedy of the Commons. Those taxes end up paying for other programs. They might be incentives to not waste as much, although it is kind of negative, so people don't really like that. And so it's really hard usually, though, for people to lower the waste that way. It's hard for people to remember to bring reusable bags. A lot of people think that instead of maybe incentivizing and giving 5 cents back, if you bring a reusable bag, would be more positive. Either way, there's pros and cons to all of these things. Here's our first restore idea. We could reclaim landfills. So modern landfills look like the following. They're usually lined, all right, and then trash is thrown in. There's usually a cap, and there's usually a liner on the bottom so that things don't leak out. So the pros of reclaiming a landfill, that means that people are taking equipment and they're opening the landfill back up in order to find recyclable or sellable materials like the soil, because we know that soil is non-renewable. And the nice thing is if we add those liners in to make them better on the old landfills, it might save our drinking water in the long run. We could also reclaim landfills by putting in structures like a methane recovery system. Methane, we know, is a greenhouse gas, and it's even worse than carbon dioxide. It's 12 times as worse. And so if we collect that, we can make sure it's not getting out into the atmosphere. Methane is also natural gas, so we can also use it as a fossil fuel, and they can sell that and make money back. The hard part about opening back up a landfill is that it's hazardous for the people that are doing so. Sometimes they collapse, they smell really awful. There can be gas leaks of that methane that can be explosive. It's expensive and time consuming. And really, do we want the landfill in the first place? So this is ways to make landfills a little bit better. Waste to energy programs, they are how we can actually, instead of just throwing things in the landfill, let's burn the waste. And if we burn the waste, it could turn a turbine with that hot steam. It is going to make it so that only the remaining ash might have to go in the landfill. The hard part is if these aren't really well filtered, they can produce really bad air pollutants. They produce particulate matter, and they produce dioxins and heavy metals like mercury, and that's pretty bad. We know mercury is a bioaccumulator. So in general, we could have less space. It takes up less space in the landfill, and we can use the ash sometimes to make roads, but not the best plan in general. Last but not least, we could implement incentives to just remove the waste when it's already in the environment. These are really hard to do, but they're happening kind of nearby in Baltimore Inner Harbor. There's these really cool trash pickup creature looking things that skim the top of the water and they collect things. We'll check out the website in class. These are really expensive usually to set up, even though they're great once they're there. The problem is this is very reactive instead of removing the waste before it even reaches the environment. It's also very technocentric. The problem is some places like LADCs can't afford this, and some places that are like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch are out of reach of a particular county like Baltimore that we might be able to pay for this. So in general, there's pros and cons to all of these, but hopefully you're thinking about your own personal opinions. I know this was long, but we're going to dig into this in class and figure out what you think is the best methods, and is it always going to be the same for all types of waste, and what we should do in our school and in our homes. Great job, guys.